evening's talk. My name is Jay Wyatt. I'm the director of the Robert C. Byrd Center for Congressional History and Education. And I know that many of you know that, but I also know that I've seen a lot of new names and pictures coming up. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome. Before we get started, I want to run through our format real quick. And I'm going to begin by asking that you all mute your mics and turn off your cameras and try to keep them that way for the duration of the talk. We're recording this program so that we can post it to our YouTube channel, and that works best if mics are muted and cameras are turned off. We're going to generally follow a sort of a standard talk followed by a Q&A tonight, and certainly when we get to the Q&A portion, you can turn your cameras on, but we do sort of ask that you keep your mics muted. And if you want to submit questions, please use the chat box, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. And I should say too that if you have a question that comes to mind during the talk tonight, please do submit it via the chat box. And if there's an opportunity, I'll break in and present it. And if not, we can get to it early on in the Q&A. So please do submit questions throughout the talk. And just as if we were meeting in person at the Byrd Center, which still seems unfortunately a good ways off, I ask that you try to keep your questions concise and that you do make sure that they are in fact questions. So moving on, I also want to take a very brief moment to thank the many of you who have made contributions to support the Byrd Center in recent weeks and recent months. We very much appreciate your support. As many of you know, our programs are donor supported and we cannot conduct them without your ongoing generosity. And if you haven't made a contribution but are considering it, or if you enjoyed tonight's program and want to support more programs like it, please visit our website at byrdcenter.org and consider making a contribution. Again, we would very much appreciate it. Tonight, we are privileged to be joined by Matthew Algeo, who will be talking about his excellent new book, All This Marvelous Potential, which turns our attention back to Bobby Kennedy's 1968 tour of Eastern Kentucky. And this trip is interesting because, as I'm sure Matthew will discuss, it's been far less studied than Bobby Kennedy's famed 1967 trip to the Mississippi Delta, which historians and other scholars have generally cited as really one of the critical moments or inflection points in Kennedy's life that inspired him to then challenge President Lyndon Johnson for the Democratic nomination for president in 1968. This trip that's profiled in All This Marvelous Potential takes place less than a year later. And then we see Bobby Kennedy testing his anti-war and anti-poverty messages in places that were not necessarily known for being all that accepting of them, and with what he called hard scrabble white voters, or to borrow one of John Kennedy's favorite adjectives, quote unquote, tough white voters. And these were the same voters that many Democrats, even as early as 1966 and 67 and 68, feared were growing estranged from the party and the New Deal coalition, which had held it in power for the better part of the middle 20th century. And what's interesting is that the concerns and the discontents that the voters in this part of Appalachia share with Kennedy revealed that those concerns were very much valid. And moving forward, they also bear a striking resemblance to the contemporary issues that very much dominate the news and our political discourse today. And I'm not going to give away too much more of Matthew's story, though, but all of that is to say that this book very much reinforces Mark Twain's famous adage that the past doesn't repeat, but it does very often rhyme. It also happens to be on sale at Four Seasons Books in Shepherdstown, which is our favorite local independent bookseller. I know for a fact that it is there and in stock because I saw it yesterday. So I very much encourage you all to, if you like the talk, if you're interested in the topic, pop in to see the staff at Four Seasons and pick up a copy. Uh, Ladies and gentlemen, Matthew Algeo is an award-winning journalist and author. He has reported from 4 continents, and his stories have appeared on some of the most popular public radio programs in the United States. Matthew is the author of 6 books, including Harry Truman's excellent adventure, The True Story of a Great American Road Trip, which was named one of the best books of 2009 by the Washington Post. He is also the author of The President is Sick, which focuses on President Grover Cleveland's secret surgery aboard a friend's yacht to remove a cancerous tumor in 1893, an event which was subsequently covered up and kept from the American people for about 2 decades. So another case of the past certainly rhyming with the present. Matthew holds a degree in folklore from the University of Pennsylvania, and he is joining us tonight from Sarajevo, where he currently lives and where it is well past midnight. And so we very much appreciate you staying up late and joining us tonight to give us this talk. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Matthew. And again, everyone, please do mute your microphones and turn off your cameras.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you very much. And thank you also to the Byrd Center for inviting me to participate in this forum. It's not a great time for people who are trying to sell books, especially if you're trying to do a book tour. So virtual events like this are fantastic, and I really appreciate the Byrd Center reaching out to me. And thanks to all of you who are online now. More than 50 people RSVP'd for the event, which is pretty cool. That's a pretty good turnout for a book talk, and I'm very pleased about that. As Jay said, I am in Sarajevo, and it is 1:08 in the morning here. So I'm happy to be up and doing this presentation. Sometimes there may be little hiccups in the internet connection. We have some problems with connectivity here, but on the whole, it shouldn't be too bad. Just to give you a little bit of background about myself, I'm originally from a town, actually, the town next door to where Jay is from. I'm from Perkins, Pennsylvania, which is a small town about 30 miles north of Philadelphia. And I grew up there. I'm from a big family. I'm the youngest of 7. And as Jay mentioned, I actually majored in folklore in college. It turned out to be not a very lucrative choice, but it worked out for me. I worked in public radio after college for many years and worked at different stations in Seattle, in Minnesota, and St. Louis. Met my wife in St. Louis. And I worked at a program called Marketplace, which is a business news program. And I was in Los Angeles for a couple of years. And in 2005, my wife passed the Foreign Service exam and was offered an appointment in the U.S. Foreign Service, which she accepted. And since then, we've been moving around the world quite a bit. We have lived in Mali in West Africa. We did a tour in Rome for 2 years, and then we went to Mongolia, Mozambique, and now we are in Bosnia and Herzegovina in the capital of Sarajevo. So it's been a very interesting time and a good opportunity for me to do some writing. We usually go home between tours, and that gives me a chance to do research on projects in Washington. And then when we go overseas, it gives me plenty of time to write the books, and it's not too bad. It's kind of a hobby that makes a little bit of money. When you're writing books about Grover Cleveland, you're not going to get rich. I can guarantee you that. But it's been a lot of fun and a good way for me to pursue something that I really enjoy. The books I wrote earlier, Jay mentioned one was Harry Truman's Excellent Adventure, and The President is a Sick Man is a book about secret operation on Grover Cleveland. And I wrote a book about the 1943 merger of the Steelers and the Eagles to create the Steagles, because during World War II, the NFL was so short of players that they had to merge 2 teams and become one team. And so I was thinking of trying to think of book ideas in 2016, actually. And I'm going to go to the share screen function in here, see if this works. If I can pull up Keynote and share, we'll put up the big slide here. Get this out of the way. There we go. So hopefully that will be up there. 2016, I was trying to think of a book to write. Of course, the election in 2016 had a lot of people thinking about a lot of different things. And when Donald Trump won the election in 2016, it called to mind this that Kennedy had taken in 1968. And I had heard of the trip. I mean, I knew a little bit about it. I didn't really know that much about it, but I did know that in 1968, Bobby Kennedy was running for president. He was running as a liberal, fairly unabashed. He had become an anti-war candidate, anti-poverty candidate, and I knew he went to Appalachia, and I knew he had campaigned there very credibly. And so when I looked at some of the election results that came in 2016, and then I was curious, well, how big of a change had there been in the results since the time of Kennedy's trip? And here you can see the results for Lyndon Johnson in 1964, winning 2/3 of the vote, and then in 2016, you see Donald Trump, of course, with a considerable majority. This is in Letcher County, Kentucky, which is more or less picked at random. Most of the counties in Kentucky would reflect similarly. Letcher County, the county seat is Whitesburg, which is actually a little more liberal probably than most county seats in eastern Kentucky. And so the question, I guess, on a lot of people's minds was, what happened? So a lot of people who are smarter than me have written books about that and tried to explain it. And as I began researching the book, I really became less interested really in what happened in 2016 than in what happened in 1968. I was really surprised, and I shouldn't have been, but I was, to find out how interesting and fascinating the 1960s were in Appalachia. Now, where I grew up outside Philadelphia, I always think of the 1960s, and I was born in 1966, so I really have no memory of the 1960s. When I think of the 60s, I think of San Francisco and the Summer of Love and Woodstock. I don't really think of Kentucky. I don't think of West Virginia. So it really struck me that some amazing things were going on in Appalachia in the 1960s. And, it's like the 1960s happened in Appalachia too. And those were the stories that I was really interested in telling. And I thought by using the Kennedy trip, I could tell some of the stories of some of the people and some of the programs that were engaged in Appalachia in the 1960s. Here's a picture of Bobby Kennedy that I really like. This is from, it was taken, I think, in late 1967. I'm sure most of you know the basic background of Bobby Kennedy. He was born November 20th, 1925, the seventh of 9 children. It's funny, I gave a talk in Wheeling at the Ohio County Public Library, excuse me, where they have very good programs for authors there. And after I gave the talk, a man came up to me and said, "I have the same birthday as Bobby Kennedy." And I thought, oh, that's great. And he said, the same date. And he was actually born on November 20th, 1925. I guess he was 94 at the time, and still very active in retirement, and came to all the book talks at the Ohio County Public Library in Wheeling, and still an avid reader. And it just really struck me that, we forget. It's quite possible that Bobby Kennedy could still be alive today. Of course, his mother lived to be over 100, and Ethel, his widow, is still alive. So it's not so long ago when you think about it. Kennedy went to college at Harvard. He went to law school at UVA. And in 1951, he went to work for the Justice Department in Washington, got a job working for the Attorney General in Washington. And in 1952, he went to work for the Senate, became a Senate counsel, and worked most famously on Joe McCarthy's committee. So Bobby Kennedy in the 1950s did not have a reputation as a liberal. He was regarded as a a pretty law and order conservative kind of guy working for Joe McCarthy in the Senate. So it was interesting as I researched the book to see the progression of Bobby Kennedy, the evolution of his politics. Of course, in 1960, his brother Jack ran for president, and West Virginia was the most important primary that the Kennedys had to win. Bobby was the campaign manager for his brother Jack. At the time, he was 34, 35, 34 actually. This is a picture that was taken in Bluefield, West Virginia, very, very far down south. And I just love it. I think, Bobby Kennedy looks like he's 17 in that picture. It looks like he's having some ice cream at this drive-in, and the guy behind the wheel has got the map on the steering wheel. It's just the very, very evocative image. West Virginia in 1960. JFK was really pretty profoundly affected by the campaign in West Virginia. One of my favorite anecdotes is JFK was talking to a couple of old coal miners, and one of them said, "Is it true that you've never really had to work a day in your life?" And Jack Kennedy thought for a minute and said, "Well, I have to admit there is some truth to that." And the old miner said, "Well, don't worry, you haven't missed a goddamn thing." So Kennedy was really touched by the people that he met in West Virginia, and also very touched by the poverty. Both Jack and Bobby really had not seen American poverty up close, really until this election in 1960, and in West Virginia in particular. And so Kennedy, it was something that really stayed with John Kennedy. And in July of 1963, a book came out. It was called Night Comes to the Cumberlands. It was by Harry Caudle, who was from Whitesburg, Kentucky. And it was really an expose on conditions in Appalachia at the time, really exposed environmental and economic problems, mostly related to mining, especially strip mining. And Jack Kennedy, don't know if he read the book. We know he read the very long review that was in the New Yorker, and was very much moved by what Caudle was saying, and pledged to visit Eastern Kentucky to see the situation for himself. In fact, Kennedy made plans to visit Eastern Kentucky in late 1963, and was planning to visit Eastern Kentucky after he returned from his trip to Dallas. And of course, we know what happened in Dallas. At his very last cabinet meeting before he left for Dallas, Kennedy was scribbling on a yellow notepad, legal pad, and he was just doodling, but he doodled over and over the word poverty. And that was the last notes that Kennedy left from his cabinet meetings. So we know, of course, after Kennedy was assassinated, that Lyndon Johnson became president. Johnson becomes president, and in 1964, in his first State of the Union address, Johnson promises to carry on the legacy of John Kennedy and announces something he called the War on Poverty. And the goal, he said, was to end poverty in America. And it was an ambitious program, cost something like $1 billion, a couple $1 billion. And it was something that LBJ took to heart. Johnson himself, of course, had grown up very poor in Texas, and he was well acquainted with poverty, unlike the Kennedys. And it was something that Johnson believed in. And so in April of 1964, April 24th, Johnson went to visit Eastern Kentucky. He just flew down in a helicopter, got out, and went to visit this family, the Tom Fletcher family. Here you can see him on the front porch. You can just barely see Mr. Fletcher. His face is obscured behind Lyndon Johnson there on the front porch of his house. This was in Inez, Martin County, Kentucky, by the way. A real in and out trip, really a publicity stunt that Johnson wanted to do to call attention to the problem, but it must have worked, because 4 months later, in August of '64, the Economic Opportunity Act was passed, and this is what contained all the programs involved in the war on poverty, and created the Office of Economic Opportunity, the OEO, and this is the government agency that oversaw the implementation of all these programs to fight poverty. That same month, in August of 1964, is when Robert Kennedy announced that he would be running for United States Senate from New York. Although he wasn't from New York, he wasn't required to be from New York. There was no residency requirement in New York at the time to run for the United States Senate. I believe there still is not. And so Kennedy ran for the Senate and won. And in November of 1964, he won election to the Senate. And in the following January, he became a United States Senator, the third Kennedy to serve in the Senate, and almost instantly became the most famous senator in America. It was quite an astounding transformation, really, in the space of a year to go from Attorney General, his brother's assassination, and then he was elected to the Senate. Flashing forward to early 1968, Kennedy has become disenchanted with the war in Vietnam. In January of '68, he gave a famous speech and announced his opposition to the war in Vietnam. He also became very concerned about the problem of poverty. Jay mentioned at the beginning of the talk his famous trip in 1967 to Mississippi, to the Delta, to visit Black families there who were living in unspeakable poverty at the time. And again, I think Kennedy was very moved. And he wanted to take a look at poverty among the whites, as he said. He wanted to show that poverty was not just a Black problem, and it was not just a white problem, but an American problem. And I think that's one of the reasons that he wanted to go to Kentucky. He probably had some ulterior motives as well. By February of 1968, Kennedy was thinking about running for president. He wouldn't officially announce until March, but it was clear by February that he was probably going to challenge Lyndon Johnson for the Democratic nomination. So in a way, he saw this as a way to maybe do a dry run for his presidential campaign by going to Eastern Kentucky and spending a couple days there. This had all the trappings of a campaign trip, with meetings with local officials and speeches on the courthouse steps. Ostensibly, he went as a member of the Senate Subcommittee on Labor, Manpower, and Poverty. And he conducted hearings while he was in Eastern Kentucky. And he was the only member of the committee, so it was a one-man subcommittee that went down to Eastern Kentucky for these 2 days. You could see it was a pretty whirlwind trip. He flew commercial. I think he flew Eastern, Eastern from Washington National. Obviously, it wasn't called Reagan yet. Down to Lexington. The governor of Kentucky offered him use of a state car and a trooper to drive him, and the trooper was the only security that was provided on the trip, which really astounded me, you know. But I guess times were different, and they drove then all around Eastern Kentucky. You can see it was a pretty packed schedule. They went to the Vortex School, Barwick School, Hazard. And we'll go through these stops on the trip as I go along, but just wanted to give you an overview, really, of what the trip looked like. The first stop he made was at a one-room schoolhouse in Wolfe County. Vortex was the name of this community, and he held a hearing here. Again, a one-man subcommittee hearing on the subcommittee on poverty, and one of the interesting things that Kennedy learned on the trip, and I learned as I was researching the book, is that defining poverty has always been kind of fraught, and it's political in its own way, just defining what poverty is and who lives in poverty. Really, it wasn't until the 50s that the U.S. government tried to come up with a systematic way of defining poverty, and it was a bureaucrat, a woman named Molly Orshansky. She was a researcher, first for the Agriculture Department, then the Social Security Administration. And I just want to read a paragraph here to talk about how Molly Orshansky came up with the formula. In 1958, Orshansky moved from agriculture to the Social Security Administration, where she would work until her retirement in 1982. It was there that Orshansky was tasked with estimating the number of American children living in poverty. Using the Department of Agriculture's dietary guidelines, she calculated the minimum income needed to feed a family of 4. She determined that approximately a third of the average family's income was spent on food. She calculated the cost of the other essentials, clothes, housing, medical care, and determined that a family of 4 required a minimum income of $3,165 annually to meet its basic needs. Based on her calculations, Orshansky estimated that between a quarter and a third of all American children were, in her words, growing up in the gray shadow of poverty. What's interesting is that when Orshansky came up with this formula, a third of the family's income was spent on food, and housing was almost an incidental cost. And today that's been completely reversed, of course. Housing is much more expensive than food. Orshansky realized this as soon as 1977. She came up with a new formula that would have taken into account falling food prices and rising housing costs. The new formula, though, would have raised the poverty line for a family of 4 from $5,800 to $6,600, and in a stroke, increased the number of people living in poverty from 26 million to 36 million. Of course, that's politically untenable. So the formula for establishing what the poverty line is really hasn't changed since Molly Orshansky came up with it in the late 1950s. And it keeps the official number of people who are living in poverty artificially low because it kind of reflects what the state of the cost of living was in 1958. So I found that to really be fascinating about how just defining what poverty is so difficult and also very, very political. This is a typical one-room schoolhouse. Kennedy visited 2 of these on his trip, and I was just interested. I think this photograph, I think they cleaned up the schoolhouse. This is circa 1967. These pictures, most of these pictures, by the way, are from the Appalachian Volunteers, which was a organization, a volunteer organization that sort of morphed into a government, a fully funded government organization. I'll talk about them a little bit later. But this is a one-room schoolhouse in Eastern Kentucky, circa 1967. In 1965, there were 553 one-room schoolhouses in Kentucky. In 1975, just 10 years later, there were 9. So many people that I spoke with when I was researching the book pointed to this as one of the great achievements of the war on poverty, especially money that went to improve roads. Once roads were built, school buses could transport kids, and it made it much easier for schools to be consolidated. And that was pretty much the end of the one-room schoolhouse. The last one-room schoolhouse in Kentucky closed in 1989. The next stop that Kennedy made was a place called the Barwick School. And here he just stopped to visit some children who were, just to visit the schoolhouse. Let's see if I can go. Oops. Why am I not? Let me see here. I seem to be frozen. There we go. That is Miss Bonnie Jean Carroll, and she was the teacher at the Barwick Schoolhouse in Barwick, Kentucky. And she was just such a lovely woman. And the people I met while I was researching this book were just so nice and warm and opened their homes to me and gave me so much time. And Bonnie remembered well when Robert Kennedy came to visit her little one-room schoolhouse in the hollow in Barwick. And I asked her why they picked her. She said probably because we were the poorest. It was a very, very poor community. And she taught grades 1 through 8, usually about 15 to 20 kids in this school. And, I think a lot, well, I do anyway, I had the impression when I think of a one-room schoolhouse, I think of it as being sort of quaint, like, Little House on the Prairie, but it was hard work. It was really hard work. And, Bonnie would have to prepare class plans for 8 different grades every day. She would use the older kids, she said. The older girls would help teach the younger grades. The older boys would help keep the school up. make sure that the the big potbelly stove in the middle of the room was kept up to date and maintained, and the building was maintained. And so the older kids were expected to pitch in to help do that. So it was really interesting learning about one-room schoolhouses and really the system of education that was in place in Eastern Kentucky at the time. And really this applies throughout Appalachia. This is the Barwick School today. Lou Murray, a young woman I met who's an excellent photographer and works in Kentucky, and took some of the pictures for the book for me. And there's the building today, and it's amazing. It's really one of the few that one-room schoolhouses still standing. Obviously, the building has fallen into disrepair. It was used as a library for a time, but now it just sits empty, and it looks a little forlorn to me. It was closed in 1972. And Robert Kennedy was there. He visited this school on February 13th, 1968. From the Barwick School, Kennedy went to Hazard, Kentucky, and visited with an African-American community there. Liberty Street is where the Black community was based in Hazard, Kentucky, and it was interesting to learn a lot about African-American history and heritage in Appalachia. Again, something that really I should have known more about and really haven't studied and didn't realize what a significant contribution that African-Americans had made to the development of Appalachia. The redevelopment of this community after Kennedy's visit was also cited by people as a very important achievement of the war on poverty. Liberty Street was completely redeveloped in the early 1970s, and it had a huge effect on the community there. The media interest in the trip obviously was very high. Kennedy at the time was the most famous senator in America, was thinking of challenging Lyndon Johnson, had all but declared his candidacy for the presidency. But I met Peter Edelman, who was one of RFK's Senate aides, and he's a professor at Georgetown Law School now. And his wife, Marion Wright Edelman, worked at the Children's Defense Fund for many years. And he was so, again, the people who were so helpful. But he talked about, he was in charge of planning this trip, and he didn't expect there to be quite as much interest as there was. And so everywhere Kennedy went, this train of cars, and I also like there is like as big as boats, as you can see, this train of cars would follow him everywhere. And sometimes Kennedy would stop at a little house in a holler and get out and talk to the guy inside the house. And by the time the last car pulled up and got out, Kennedy had already left and moved on to the next one. So it was quite a media circus. Edelman says it's still one of his regrets that they didn't get a bus for the media on this trip. This picture was taken at a strip mine. That's where Kennedy went after the Barwick School, and he was very eager to see a strip mine. Kennedy was interested in the issue, had read Night Comes to the Cumberlands, and wanted to see for himself what the situation was like. This strip mine was near a place called Yellow Creek, near the town of Vico in Kentucky. Vico, which stands for Virginia Iron and Coal Company. Anyway, he went to this strip mine, and it was a pretty tense scene. It was owned by a guy named Bill Sturgill, and he was pretty notorious for not taking kindly to unannounced inspections of his strip mines, I guess you could say, and was no fan of Bobby Kennedy or Harry Caudle. But Kennedy pretty much just demanded to go see the strip mine. And what are you going to do if you're the security guard at the strip mine in Vico and Bobby Kennedy pulls up and says, I want to see the place? And so he went up there to take a look around. It took a while for them to talk his way through. I like this picture. That on the left is the foreman of the mine. Roy Mullins was his name. And he's the guy that Sturgill had appointed to sort of oversee this whole enterprise. And on the far right, you can see Congressman Carl Perkins. He was the congressman from Eastern Kentucky at the time, and he accompanied Kennedy on this trip. And I just love this picture of Bobby buttoning up his coat and the reporters all around. It's just such a great picture. From the strip mine, Kennedy went to Alice Lloyd College in Pippa Passes, Kentucky, founded in 1923 by Alice Lloyd, who was from Boston, one of these do-gooders that went down to the mountains to improve lives. But actually, she did. She founded Alice Lloyd College in Caney Creek, as it was known at the time, in 1923. She died in 1962. So for almost 40 years, she was the guiding force behind Alice Lloyd College. It was a 2-year college until 1982. It became a 4-year college. And here you can see the students all dressed up asking questions of Kennedy. This was one of the few pictures I was able to get from Alice Lloyd College. I don't know why more pictures weren't taken there, but everybody got dressed up to hear the talk by Kennedy. He was invited to Alice Lloyd by a guy named Lawrence Baldridge, great man, and a Baptist minister. He also taught English at Alice Lloyd College, and he had started a speaker series of trying to get speakers to come to the college and speak to the students, and Harry Caudle had come. And then when he heard Kennedy was coming to Eastern Kentucky, he wrote a letter to Kennedy's office in Washington, inviting him to speak at Alice Lloyd College in Pippa Passes, Kentucky. And Kennedy's office said, sure. And so that is how Reverend Baldridge was able to finagle an event with Bobby Kennedy, most famous senator in America. Reverend Baldridge was born in 1936, a Baptist minister, taught many, many years at Alice Lloyd, still active, describes himself as a pro-life liberal and somebody who has devoted his life really to improving his community. I mean, a kind of person that really is, to me, an American hero. Just like Bonnie Lee Carroll, these are people who really have done everything in their power to make life better for the people around them. This is just an example of the media coverage. It was a very well-documented trip. This is from the Hackensack Record, a Washington Post article printed there. Kennedy was, popular and famous. He received hundreds of letters a week as a U.S. senator. It was fascinating doing research for the book, going up to the Kennedy Library. Bobby Kennedy's papers are at the Kennedy Library, John Kennedy's library in Boston. And they saved all the letters, all the correspondence from people who wrote Kennedy letters, constituents, letters from all over the country. It's a little like scrolling through Twitter, just reading through these letters, just much more literate and longer. But you see all the same arguments that we're having today played out in the correspondence of Bobby Kennedy. It's really interesting. Kennedy spent the night at Alice Lloyd College, stayed in the house of one of the college vice presidents. The next morning, he got up and went to Whitesburg, which is the seat of Letcher County. And I really love this picture because of the kids just all gathering around. You can see very excited. And I talk in the book, Kennedy had a very really could connect with kids. He had 11 children of his own. I think he had 10 at the time, and then the 11th was born after he was murdered. But Kennedy really could connect with children in a way, and I like the picture here. The kids were let out of school in Whitesburg for this speech that Kennedy gave on the morning of the 14th, and you can see the crowd pushing up to him there at the courthouse in Letcher County. From Whitesburg, he went to the town of Neon, now Fleming Neon, but at the time it was still just Neon, and held a hearing in the gymnasium at Fleming Neon High School. And this is a picture of Kennedy seated with Congressman Perkins is seated on his right, the table set up in the foul lane of the basketball court. So it was a very informal kind of proceeding that Kennedy that was held in the gymnasium. Kennedy took testimony from, I think, about 20 people. Don't recall the exact number so far, but very, uh, very ordinary scene and setting. I love this photograph with the light streaming in, and that's the transcriptionist fixing her hair there. The man at the microphone is a guy named Cliston Johnson. Clickbird is how he went by, Clickbird Johnston. And he was an unemployed father of 15. And he testified at the hearing. He asked if he could speak. And I just want to read a little bit of his of what he said from the book. Johnson told Kennedy that his income was $60 a month, out of which he paid $26 for $112 in food stamps. That left him just $34 a month for all other expenses, including rent, utilities, and, quote, 100 other things. I'm not able to work, Johnson explained, but I get out and do what little bit I can, trade and traffic around. It's not easy. These food stamps last the family only about 2 weeks. And from that on, it's beans and bread, and the next week it's bread and beans. The audience laughed knowingly. Kennedy, however, was incredulous. You support 15 people in your family on the $112 a month, he asked. Johnson confirmed that he did, but added that he also hunted for food. I mean, like it was back in the old mountaineer days, you know, we catch what we eat. You ought to come by my house sometime and see them 15 kids in the bed, Johnson said to Kennedy. Did you ever see 15 kids in 3 beds? I'm moving in that direction, Kennedy said. The more children you've got, Johnson advised Kennedy, you just add a little bit more water to the gravy. Food stamps were a huge issue at the time, and this is another thing that Kennedy learned a lot about. You know, at the time, you had to purchase food stamps, and there was a formula that the government had, and they determined if you made so much money, you paid $30 for $50 worth of food stamps, or if you might pay $20 for $50 worth of food stamps. And so there was a sliding scale, and it wasn't until 1977, the Food Stamp Act of 1977, that ended the purchase requirement for people. So they didn't have to pay money to get food stamps, that they could receive the food stamps directly. By the way, I thought it was interesting. In 2018, 40 million Americans received assistance through the food stamp program, now known as SNAP, averaging $125.52 a month for $60 billion total. Where does all that money go? About 4% of Walmart's total sales are from food stamps. Of course, it wouldn't be the 60s without a student protest. These are students from Everett's High School, the Clover Fork Youth Group, and they were part of the Appalachian Volunteers. The Appalachian Volunteers was an organization that began in the summer of 61 or 62. And it was really just kids who went to college in Kentucky, went to Eastern Kentucky to help repair schools, mostly just paint schoolhouses. But and when the War on Poverty began in 64, it sort of blossomed into a full-fledged government program. And the Appalachian Volunteers here, I'm going to real quick just read some of the things the Appalachian Volunteers built: community centers, organized woodworking workshops and sewing circles, set up job training programs, helped unemployed miners find work outside the mines, taught families how to manage their finances, opened health clinics, libraries, thrift shops. They did so much stuff. And one of the things they did, the Appalachian Volunteers, was start youth groups. And this is the youth group that was started at Everett's High School, called the Clover Fork Group. They went to the Kennedy hearing to protest. They felt voiceless. That's why they wore the bags over their heads. I talked to a couple of the kids who attended the hearing, and it was really kind of profound. Kennedy saw them when he walked into the building and asked what the protest was about. And he invited one of them, Tommy Duff, a young man who was kind of the head of the youth group, and he actually testified at the hearing. So it was fascinating, really, to look at some of these organizations and groups that came up. From Fleming Neon, Kennedy then just drove up to Prestonsburg, where there's a small airport that he would fly out from. Here he stopped in Hammond, Kentucky, and greeted some voters on the streets. You need to find somebody who looks at you the way that woman is looking at Bobby Kennedy right there. That's all I can say. Kennedy really did make inroads with white voters. And it's interesting, I get into it in the book, and won't get into it too much here, but George Wallace was running his campaign, third party campaign in 1968 for president. And Kennedy and Wallace were really kind of trying to win the same group of voters, but obviously coming at it from very different places. So it was really interesting. One of the statistics I saw, let me see if I can find this, about Wallace. In 1964, George Wallace briefly ran for the Democratic presidential nomination, running an openly racist campaign. He managed to win nearly 30% of the vote in the Indiana primary. 4 years later, Kennedy ran in the Indiana primary on a civil rights platform and won it with 42% of the vote. So, two very different candidates in the space of 4 years with very different platforms, but the same group of voters supporting them. I thought that was just really interesting. I like this photo too. That's Kennedy. Kennedy would just stop and visit people randomly on the side of the road. Drove his assistants and his aides crazy. But this is in Hemphill, Kentucky. He stopped and visited this home. James Johnson is this man in the background there. He owned a small store, and Kennedy stopped to chat with him. Kennedy returned to Washington on February 15th, and the staff prepared a big memo with recommendations. Kennedy announced his candidacy for president in March, and then, of course, he was assassinated in June of 1968. One of the things that I found particularly striking was that it's generally regarded that the war on poverty was a failure, but when you look at the statistics, poverty really dropped off dramatically in the 1960s. It started before the war on poverty began, but 1959 poverty level about 22%, and then in 1969 it's down to about 12%. I think got down as low as 11%. So really poverty was cut in half in the space of really 12 years or so. So quite dramatic improvement. And then you can see today it's back. It's just stayed pretty stubbornly between 11 and 15% for the last 50 years. So it was quite the downward trajectory. Of course, Johnson did not run for re-election, and Nixon was elected in 1968. Nixon inherited the war on poverty. He wasn't entirely opposed to it, but he did have to placate Southern conservatives who hated it. And so he put in charge of the Office of Economic Opportunity, the OEO, which is the agency that oversaw the war on poverty, had to find somebody to run that. It was a thankless job, but he managed to find somebody, an obscure congressman from Illinois named Donald Rumsfeld. And Rumsfeld took over the OEO. One of his first hires was a very ambitious young congressional page, an intern named Dick Cheney. So Rumsfeld and Cheney took over the war on poverty, and they did manage to bring that war to an end at least. So so many people I spoke with, I really had memories and mementos, and this is the final slide, but I just love this. It's Nell Mead, now Nell Fields, was in high school and went with two friends, her sister Judy Mead and their friend Shirley Gibson. And they went to see Kennedy when he was at Fleming Neon High School, and they needed an excuse note because they were going to miss school. So Nell came up with this idea to pre-write an excuse note, and you can't really read it, but it says, "Please excuse from school Nell Mead, Judy Mead, Shirley Gibson. They attended my meeting." And then they had Bobby Kennedy sign it at the bottom. That in the blue ink is R. Kennedy. And this is what they used as their excuse note. And Nell Fields still holds on to this and cherishes it to this day. So I just thought that was really pretty cool. So if anybody has any questions, I don't know if Jay, if you've received any questions, or if anybody had anything to say, I'm happy to talk some more. I've had coffee. Oops. Hang on, Jay, I can't hear you. Is it my fault? No.
Okay. Is that
there
better?
we go.
Okay, there we go. microphone problems. No, for anyone, please do, contribute some questions for Matthew. I'm curious to, it is such a, 1968 is such a, volatile time. 1967 was, very volatile as well. And so, how did he have a sense for that as he's heading down there? Did you get the feeling in your research that he kind of thought that he was walking into an area where there were some pretty disgruntled people, and was that sort of part of the strategy, or was this kind of in a very sort of Kennedy-esque, kind of we'll just go in there and sort of talk to some people and shake some
Yeah.
hands and
He was, I was kind of amazed at how fearless he really was. I think part of that is his life experience. And I think after the death of his brother, he really, he really kind of had a new conviction in how he approached things. I think he was surprised by the intensity of people's opinions and emotion when he was in Eastern Kentucky. He's genuinely surprised at some of the things he learns. Like I talked to the Clifton Johnson thing. He just can't believe that people are living on as little money as they are. So I think it was one of those rare unscripted trips, unscripted experience. I think now if a Senate committee does a thing like this, it's just a whole, it's theater. People know, they know what they're going to hear. They know what the questions are going to be. It wasn't like that at all. In fact, Clifton Johnson, who testified, he hadn't been cleared. He just came up to Kennedy and asked if he could talk, and Kennedy said, "Sure, I'd like to hear what you have to say." So I think Kennedy went into it fearlessly but naive, if that makes any sense. I think he learned a lot more than he thought he would learn. And he's there. At one point he says something like, "I thought I'd seen everything in Mississippi," and then he, came to Eastern Kentucky and saw people living in dire poverty there. So, he went in with his eyes open, and he definitely knew there were problems, but I think they were even bigger than he expected.
So Ree has asked, did the man with 15 children get any relief?
I hope he did. One of the biggest changes that actually came out of this trip that you could make a direct correlation was ending the requirement for people to purchase food stamps. And I go into the history of food stamps, which I write about it so fascinatingly. But it really is interesting how the food stamp program began in the 30s as a way to feed people, yes, but also as a way to help prop up businesses, groceries, because they had all this surplus food that they were going to destroy to artificially raise farm prices. And so they didn't want to just throw this food away. So they thought, well, we could give it to people. But then the grocers said, wait a minute, if you give it directly to people, they won't buy it from us. And so they came up with the plan of food stamps, that people would buy the food stamps, and then they could buy the groceries from the grocer, and then the grocer could redeem the stamps. So it was really a welfare program, not just for hungry people, but for businesses as well. Like I said, still 4% of Walmart's income. So anyway, I hope Mr. Johnson benefited, because the requirement for purchasing the food stamps was eventually eliminated.
Your use of talking about the constituent correspondence and how illuminating that is right on point. We have thousands and thousands.
I imagine. I bet.
West Virginians in similar circumstances wrote to Senator Byrd over his career, and one things like you just showed, little scraps of paper, anything that they can get there could put down just to get that ask out there. So yeah, it's interesting from a content perspective, but also a material culture kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating just to see the kind of stationery people use, the handwriting. I mean, it's just, people have such nice handwriting back then. Now I don't think anybody can write cursive anymore.
Yeah, right. So Susan has asked, who did Appalachia end up supporting in the 1968 election?
Very good question. Kentucky, Kentucky voted for Humphrey, but I would need to check what the breakdown was in Eastern Kentucky. And when I did the graph, I wanted to do the election before, because this is when Kennedy he's coming in 4 years later, presumably riding in on the coattails. It's really not until the 70s that you see the flip in Kentucky. And one of the things I talk about in the book is that I think a lot of people that I spoke with feel like they haven't changed, that the parties kind of have reconfigured around them. And I mentioned Reverend Baldridge, who calls himself a pro-life liberal, and abortion is, I don't go into too much in the book, but at the time, at Kennedy's trip in the 60s, the Democrats were the anti-abortion party. Two of the biggest Democratic Party constituencies were Roman Catholics and African Americans, and those groups have both historically opposed abortion. And the Republicans, Barry Goldwater, his wife founded Planned Parenthood of Arizona. Barry Goldwater was a member of Planned Parenthood of Arizona and took a very sort of libertarian view toward it. The government didn't have any place. And so you really don't see until the 70s. In fact, it's not until 76, even at the 76 convention, Democratic convention in New York, there were still floor fights about what the party's platform on abortion should be. So it's just one of those interesting issues that shows you how the parties kind of reconfigure. And of course, the Republicans then moved to pick up disaffected white Southern voters into the Republican Party in the 70s.
Yeah, yeah. So Sheila has asked, were Rumsfeld, Freudian slip, were Rumsfeld and Cheney both Republicans back then?
Yes, yeah. So when Nixon took over in 68, Rumsfeld was a Republican congressman from Illinois, from the Chicago suburbs, though you could almost call him a liberal Republican. That was the other interesting. There were still liberal Republicans back then and very conservative Democrats. So the parties had much wider tents at that time. Both parties did. You had wings in the Democratic Party, liberal and conservative, in the same way in the Republican Party, liberal and conservative. And of course, up in Pennsylvania, there were liberal Republican. There were a lot of liberal Republicans. So Cheney was probably more on the liberal side of the Republican Party at that time. I'm sorry, Rumsfeld, and then Cheney. Cheney was younger than Rumsfeld. He was a I forget, are they page or intern? What do you call it? Is a congressional intern.
Intern, well, there's both. In the
Okay.
Senate, there are pages. Those are usually younger kids. But
Okay.
No, all congressional offices have interns.
Yeah, I think he was an intern. He was an intern for one of the members of Congress from Wyoming, and that was his kind of his first big break in government when Rumsfeld hired him to be his right-hand man at OEO.
Yeah, and your point that both were very ambitious is spot on. And Rumsfeld was very involved. He was as a young congressman in terms of looking to overturn the seniority systems and some of those things, get newer members more power and more say, which was not all that different from what some of the younger members who were coming out of the movement, the social movements, were.
Right.
So he wasn't as much of an outlier as I think then as he became. I think you're right in that. So Jody asked, did Bobby Kennedy speak about the Appalachian Regional Development Act during his tour? That was a big piece of legislation that was passed in the beginning of the Great Society. And
yeah, and of course, Bobby, when he got to the Senate, the Appalachian Regional Commission and the development program were a very big part of his agenda. And of course, Appalachia extends up into New York State, and so he set up. So he did actually. talk he gave at Alice Lloyd College. He really gets into development in Appalachia and answered students' questions about that. He envisioned it more as something like the Tennessee Valley Authority. It didn't really have a lot of the legislation that established the Appalachian Regional, the ARC, didn't have a lot of teeth. And so I think he was even by then already disappointed with the direction that things were going. He had hoped it would be a real economic development program like it had been in the Tennessee Valley. And I think he was disappointed that it didn't really turn out that way. It really got bogged down in the politics, and it was very difficult because of the regional, going from New York State down to, Georgia, you can imagine what some of those meetings are like. It could get anything done.
Yeah, it covers 13 states, and a broad swath of the western part of the eastern seaboard. Ray asked, well, first he said he loved your book on Truman's Excellent Adventure, but also, did LBJ have any reaction to Bobby's actions regarding rural poverty?
No, I guess is the short answer. One of the things, it's in 1968, things are happening so fast that there's not. It's a little bit like today, where it feels like a week, it takes a year, and so much happens in a week. And so, really, by the time Kennedy got back to Washington in mid to late February, the Tet Offensive was in full swing in Vietnam, and that kind of knocked poverty off of the front page. And so there's really I don't have a lot of reaction directly that Johnson had to Kennedy on this trip. The Johnson-Kennedy relationship, a lot of people have explored that. It was very complicated, and they had a very complex relationship. But I certainly don't think Johnson was happy that Kennedy was going down to Kentucky to show how poor people were 4 years after the Economic Opportunity Act was passed. The EOA was actually up for renewal in '68. So this was another big landmark, a milestone that was coming up for the act. So in a way, Kennedy you could argue he was either showing the need to renew the act or showing that the act, it hadn't worked in 4 years, so why keep spending more money? So depending on your perspective, that's how you could interpret it. So undoubtedly, Johnson probably wasn't happy about Kennedy going down there, but Johnson was interested in poverty as an issue, and so it's not like he was opposed to finding some remedial measures to combat it.
In a lot of ways, Johnson's bona fides in terms of dealing with poverty were far deeper than Bobby Kennedy's were.
Oh yeah, yeah,
far more extensive.
If you read, the Cairo book on the early years, Johnson's, when he's growing up in, is it East Texas or West Texas? I always forget, but he grew up in real poverty. Yeah, no doubt. He knew what it was like.
Did you have a sense of, when Kennedy's kind of walking into that, and the book talks about sort of the real increasing disillusionment with government and distrust of quote unquote establishment politicians, which really in so many ways foreshadows what comes later and what really kind of becomes part of the mainstream in the late 70s and the early 80s with the conservative ascendancy and all of that. Is there a sense that is really sort of that they kind of got that, like that there was sort of this isn't working, you promised us X, right, and not received it? Or is there sort of like, this is working, but we need more help? Yeah.
One of the photos I showed was the kids who were holding up the sign at the, it's like, and I love it. It says, Don't give us promises. We can't eat your fancy promises. Give us education and jobs. So even the kids in the youth group were disillusioned, I think, in '68. And yeah, people had a sense that the government was spending all this money and it still wasn't making a difference. Now, one of the interesting things about the War on Poverty was that it funded programs directly from the federal government. And so the government would give money directly to Appalachian Volunteers, for instance. Well, this caused a lot of consternation in local governments because they were used to being the gatekeepers for all this money. And so now the federal government was bypassing them and giving money directly to grassroots organizations. So I think that was a way that the government, the War on Poverty, was trying to address the issue of people feeling like they weren't getting any help for all this money that was being spent, but it completely alienated local power structures who were used to being the gatekeepers for the money. And so they really lobbied pretty hard to put an end to the direct funding of programs from the federal government. So I think people felt disillusioned because the government was spending all this money and it wasn't helping them in their daily lives. And not only that, but the people in the courthouse clique was basically conspiring against them to keep the money out of their hands and keep them poor.
That's really interesting, and it makes me kind of think about sort of the popular mythology about the war on poverty and the kind of the discontent really orienting or being rooted in this idea that the money was going to other people, specifically minorities in urban centers, right, who were not deserving. And what you're saying is kind of, at the very least, complicating it, if not flipping that on its head a bit.
Right, right. And I really don't think, I don't think people felt like the money was going to an other. They felt like it wasn't getting to them, that there was a layer and it wasn't getting down to them.
Al has asked, what was the role of unions, or more broadly, labor in Eastern Kentucky in 1968?
Yeah, I go into that in the book, and of course, Kentucky has a fascinating labor history. And Kennedy's route took him. Everett's is a place that was a kind of one of the centers of bloody Harlan in the 30s. Union membership had already begun to decline by 68, fairly precipitously, mostly due to advances in mechanization, which made jobs obsolete in the mining industry. So the need for miners was they just didn't need as many people as they used to. And one of the people testifies to Kennedy, like 20 years ago, we needed 60 guys to do this mine, and now we only need 14. So union membership, I think, union activity was still pretty strong. And I think the identification that people had with labor unions was pretty intense still. But in sheer numbers, there weren't as many union workers in Eastern Kentucky because there just wasn't the need for as many workers. And so what do we do with all the people who've been displaced by mechanization? That was the question then, and it's still the question today.
So just kind of piggybacking on that is, the big argument against, government and all of that is that, it's policy that has kind of hindered extraction industries and specifically coal. But when you dig into it, this is the track record that you see going all the way back to the 1950s. Coal states in the 1950s basically had the exact opposite experience of, than sort of suburbanites or whatever.
Right.
And the argument is that it's not that it's mechanization. So is Kennedy picking up on that? Are they recognizing that this is a much more kind of complicated problem, or?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of things. One, I was fascinated to learn how much the technological advancements made during World War II in weapon and manufacturing were then transferred into the mining industry to make some of the giant earth moving equipment and extractors and augers that made a lot of workers redundant. Uh, Mining also, when Kennedy was there, so you have a couple of things intersecting. One is the loss of jobs due to mechanization, but the other is local opposition to mining in general because of the economic or because of the environmental damage that it does. And at the time, there was the broad form deed was the name of the. If people had sold the mineral rights to the minerals in their on their property, uh, the mining companies could do anything they wanted to extract the coal. So they could dig up, they could just destroy your property, and they had the right to do it because 100 years ago somebody had sold the mineral rights to the farm for 50 cents an acre when all mining was underground, so it really wouldn't have made much difference. And then we changed to strip mining. So yeah, so you're seeing a couple of different things that are going against mining at the time. Mining really is waging a fierce public relations battle. I found some documents from Bethlehem Steel to their public relations offensive against to counteract counter Kennedy's narrative in Eastern Kentucky. But coal, the amount of coal in the ground is finite. There's only so much that you can take, and once it's all gone, it's gone. And I think there was a feeling of that in 1968 as well. It's like no matter what, the coal is not going to be here forever. So what do we do then? And that's been that's been the question since then.
Yeah. The big, and please, if anyone else has a concluding question, please submit it. And the big question that surrounds Bobby Kennedy is always what if, and he was very much
Right.
sort of the one candidate that could kind of hold the New Deal coalition together, and maybe long enough for it to be reshaped. Is there when we talk about sort of the loss of Bobby Kennedy, we generally do not talk about it in Appalachia. Did you kind of get into any of that? Is there sort of a sense of what might have been in Appalachia that is sort of either reminiscent or equal to what we see in other parts of the country?
Yeah. And granted, I think a lot of the people I spoke to were people who really loved Bobby Kennedy. So I think they felt the loss even more keenly. And I think they felt that the world would be a different place. I don't know. I think they, especially tried to do a little class reunion for the Barwick School, which is where Bonnie Carroll was the teacher. So, but I got Bonnie and a couple of the students together, but we were talking, but they were gratified that Kennedy put this on the front burner, really, that it was an important issue to him. And as long as he kept it in the spotlight, it's an issue that would be addressed. And I think the biggest thing the loss they felt, apart from the personal or the political, was that, okay, the advocate for this issue was gone. And who would advocate for them now? I really think people felt like that. And I think, since then people talk about everybody come, you got to do the Kentucky trip, I mean, Gary Hart and Ted Kennedy and everybody, I was talking to, was it the guy who, the Mountain Eagle, which is the newspaper in Whitesburg, but Ben Gish, he's the publisher there. But yeah, he talks about, oh yeah, every 4 years we start getting phone calls and people want to go do the tour. We're going to recreate Bobby's tour, but nobody has ever put it back on the, the front page of the Washington Post. And so I think that was how the loss was felt most acutely, as an advocate, losing an advocate.
Yeah. Interesting. Very interesting. Does anyone else have any questions for Matthew? It is now I'm guessing well past 2 o'clock in the morning where you
Yeah, well,
are.
now I might as well stay up for the debate at this point.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Does anybody else have any questions? If not, I'm gonna let Matthew go and let you all go. And yeah, there is a debate tonight, so you can engage that and sort of think about how these conversations are still with us. Okay. Well, if not, and people are already saying thank you, and on behalf of everybody in Shepherdstown in our local area, I just want to say thank you, Matthew. This was really fantastic, and the book is great, and
Thank you.
we'd love to have you back to talk about Grover Cleveland or Harry Truman at some other point.
I want to come down and I'd love to come down sometime and sit with you and go through some of the letters that Senator Byrd got. I think that'd be a lot of fun. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're here. They are incredibly moving and touching.
Yeah.
So yeah, anytime we are here and we're open. So let us know.
Excellent. Well, keep up the good work, and thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed it.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Good night, everybody. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks,
We
everybody.
will see you and talk to you all very soon. Thank you very much.